Okay, hello everyone. I'm Steve Zipperstein, Faculty Director of the Yunus and Soraya Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at UCLA. A warm welcome to all of you on our webinar today regarding the recent events in Iran, which we have entitled "Is the Islamic Republic on the verge of collapse? And if so, what next?" We are incredibly honored here at the Nazarian Center to be joined today by our very, very distinguished guest, Behnam Ben Taleblu of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, an independent think tank based in Washington, D.C. Behnam, for many years, has run the Iran program as the most senior scholar at the foundation, focusing on Iran, Iranian domestic affairs, Iranian regional and international affairs. Behnam has testified before the United States Congress. He's provided information through testimony to the United Kingdom Parliament, to the Government of Canada. He is a frequent guest on international media. Needless to say, the last 10 days have been incredibly busy for Behnam. He's been on the BBC, many other media around the world. We're incredibly grateful to Behnam for taking time out of his very busy schedule to give us his analysis of these incredibly dramatic events that have been occurring on the streets, not just Tehran, but the entire country over the last couple of weeks. Just a couple of housekeeping items before I turn the floor over to Behnam. First of all, one of the things that really make our webinars here at the Nazarian so successful are the questions from you, our audience. Our audience typically sends incredibly interesting and important questions, which I am happy to convey to our speakers. If you want to ask a question of Behnam, please type it in the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. I will go through the questions and select those that I think would be of most interest to our audience. Please keep your questions short, brief, to the point. No speeches, no essays. Questions for our speaker would be very much appreciated. I also want to sincerely thank our three co-sponsors for this webinar today, beginning with my home department at UCLA, the UCLA Department of Public Policy, the UCLA Center for Middle East Development, and for the first time ever in the history of the Nazarian Center, we are very proud to announce the Principles for Peace Foundation, based in Geneva, Switzerland, is co-sponsoring our webinar today, and my sincere thanks to the Principles for Peace Foundation. We have amongst our audience today people from the United States, Israel, Canada, Colombia, Germany, France, the UK, the Netherlands, Italy, Guyana, Taiwan, Syria, Turkey, Luxembourg, South Africa, Brazil, Belgium, the Czech Republic, and Sweden. A global audience joining us to hear our fantastic speaker, Behnam Ben Taleblu. And so, Behnam, please bring us up to speed. Events have been moving so rapidly. It seemed like 24 hours ago we were on the verge of perhaps a U.S. attack. Now it seems that President Trump has backed off. Where are we right now with respect to what's happening in Iran?
Well, sir, it's a real pleasure and honor to be with you and the whole team at the UCLA Nazarian Center. I could only wish we could do this in person, but thank you for making the time in your schedule on behalf of the center and everyone who is tuning in virtually and later on to catch this as well. I mean, make no mistake, we're in a historic moment. We're in a historic moment in the 4+ decade battle between the street and the state in Iran. Anybody who's been watching Iran for the past few years know that what we're seeing now is not random or isolated or sporadic, but it's part of a much larger story in the history of the Iranian street against the state, where, you know, almost as long as there's been an Islamic Republic, there's been protests against an Islamic Republic. Some observers may remember 1999, others may remember the Green Movement of 2009. Both of those were more Tehran-centric and tied to the quest for reform. But a decade of overpromise and underdelivery when it came to reform, a decade of failures, a decade of crackdowns from the Islamist state against the increasingly secular street, has led us to this boom and bust cycle of protest that we are living in since December 2017. That is a through line all the way through to women life freedom, of 2022-23. And then most importantly, and the proximate cause of why we're gathered here together today, the December 28th to present round of protests, which is now 3 weeks and counting, plus a 1 week national internet outage, which is historic in the Islamic Republic, because the last time there was a long internet outage was a little bit during the 12-day war, but also during the November 2019 uprising. And back then, unfortunately, and I say again, unfortunately, because it's happened again, I coined the phrase, it's not just democracy per the Washington Post that dies in the darkness, it's Iranians that die in the darkness. Whenever this regime throttles and then later shuts down the internet, that's when the massive crackdown comes. In this case, the regime was A, afraid of Iranians communicating with one another, B, afraid of the bridges that were increasingly being built between domestic dissidents and the foreign diaspora, and then most importantly, to be able to prevent images and video and stories of their massive crackdown from getting out. So that larger series of images of protests and videos that we've seen, and that story of the boom and bust cycle of protests, you could say, is not just quote unquote another round of protests, but is the next in this series of stories that defines Iran's national uprising. Because from 2017 to present, the population has looked for every possible opportunity to voice discontent against the state, and in so doing, use explicitly non-political issues to get out onto the street for an explicitly political protest. These are not economic protests or social protests or environmental protests. They're political protests where the causal pathway or the trigger, we could say, is an economic crisis, is an environmental crisis, or is a social crisis. But the population uses that, and then there's a quick contagion effect of discontent where, again, people of different backgrounds, a very different demography, a very different geography, all kind of come together in increasingly nationalist protest slogans to signal their desire to create an Iran post-Islamic Republic. And for that, what we've seen most recently is the most violent crackdown from the state against the street. Confirmed killed 2,400 to 3,400 in terms of names, faces, places, and people, according to 2 different human rights organizations in America and in Europe. But through press reporting that is relying on internal sources, including government and military and security force sources, and perhaps most importantly, sources tied to the medical establishment, doctors, nurses, service sector, lawyers, and get this, and most gut-wrenching, morticians and morgues and staff at these places, between 12 and 20,000 killed, which again marks the most violent crackdown from the street against the state. That tells you the regime has one policy here, which is to shoot their way out of the crisis.
This is really shocking what you're telling us. To what extent has the rhetoric from President Trump helped or hurt the cause of the protesters?
One reason why, quote unquote, it's different this time was President Trump's rhetoric. Obviously, it was different because this was the first nationwide multi-city, multi-day uprising since the end of the 12-day war. And we may all remember experts then who said, oh, because Israel and America brought a conventional kinetic conflict onto Iranian territory, that A, this would short circuit the democracy movement in Iran, and that B, this would create a sustained rally around the flag. Not only less than 6 months later were Iranians out there protesting for their rights again and still trying to tank the Islamic Republic, but in the sharp contrast to the rally around the flag, Iranians had been pulling down and burning regime flags and erecting pre-1979 flags that had the national emblem of the lion and the sun. So quite literally the opposite of what many experts had said. And if anyone could really tap into this discontent, it would have been Donald Trump anyway. In term 1, some people may not know this, he actually torpedoed the taboo that used to exist in Washington about foreign political and even if only rhetorical support being a kiss of death. He was able to torpedo that. Late in his first term, he actually has the award, you could say, for having the most seen and the most liked tweet in the history of Persian Twitter when he tweeted in Persian, I think in January 2020, standing with Iranian protesters. So he was in prime position to say what he said in early January, first on Truth Social, then on a radio show, then on TV, then in press conferences, and then on Truth Social again. And what he did was he touched the protest movement. He put wind beneath the wings of Iranian protesters, and he went further than his term one commentary by essentially saying that, quote unquote, the US was locked and loaded, monitoring the situation carefully, and that would hold the regime responsible for the crackdown, quote unquote, as is its custom, because he was alluding to the previous rounds that had been violently repressed. This historicity of this statement alone put immense wind beneath the wings of Iranian protesters, and again made this time qualitatively different because it touched at the intersection of strategy and values in the Middle East for US foreign policy. But the constant reiteration of that statement against the backdrop of the constant crackdown in Iran, plus the very early statements by the president, I think on at least 2 or 3 times talking about early death counts as being the result of a stampede, began to erode you could say, the resolve of some Iranians. Nonetheless, Iranians continue to name streets after the president, send videos in English. There's even much more recently now jokes in Persian in the dribs and drabs that you can still get out in social media, fully cognizant that the president is focused on Greenland, saying that there is a town in the northeast in Iran called Sabzevar, which means Greenland, and saying, come take Sabzevar, come take Greenland. So they're quite literally trying to get the president's attention in every single way, even putting out videos where they're cursing English, saying that they're effing shooting at us, to highlight the intensity of the situation. And we are at the point, with immense respect, at this point in time when we're recording, which is midday East Coast time on January 15, when there is a diminishing point of returns of just statements alone, where it is about action. It is about the type of locked and loaded action. Obviously, if on the cyber side or if on the non-kinetic side, the US or its partners had a ground game, not physically boots on the ground game, but a way to help level the playing field between the state and the street, perhaps we would not have been in this situation, because we have been here before. Again, November 2019 should have set off an alarm bell for policymakers, the business community, the tech community, to get together for a public-private enterprise to try to thwart the regime from being able to shut off the internet again. This, per Henry Kissinger, foreign policy is not missionary work. This is not missionary work to get Iranians online. This is really tugging at the heart of what the US can try to do, which is to flip the script on the most anti-American and the most anti-Israeli state in the heartland of the Muslim Middle East, and empower the most pro-American and the most pro-Israeli society in the heartland of the Muslim Middle East. And it's increasingly becoming a missed opportunity, and I fear the higher the protest casualty count comes, and the longer the internet blackdown goes on, there is the possibility for the president to be able to push away from the table. Most recently, the president has, looked at the stay of execution of at least one protester, taking that as a potential victory of his deterrent messaging. There's also, as we speak, a dip in oil prices compared to the spike that many had thought would come, with potentially more assets moving into the region. But there are still more assets moving into the region. There was a report yesterday about a carrier strike group from the Indo-Pacific moving towards the Persian Gulf area that would allegedly, if you pass this prologue, take about 6 days maximum to get there. So never say never with this president, and the Islamic Republic really should not gamble against someone like Donald Trump, who 6 years ago this month took out the regime's chief terrorist when no other US president would, and who 6 months ago took out the crown jewel of the regime's nuclear program when no other president would. But at the same time, the president is the Teflon Don and can really pivot from his own statements. But I can't stress enough for the president that if he does covet the title of peacemaker in the Middle East, that we are beyond the point of diminishing return for statements alone, and that now is indeed the time for action. And the only pathway to pivot to Asia, the only pathway to be peacemaker in the Middle East, is again to empower the street against the state in Iran.
Okay. I have a lot more questions, but our audience has already sent me several questions. Please keep them coming, audience, because I always prefer to ask our speakers questions from our audience rather than me dominating the discussion. And so what I'm going to do, Behnam, to make it perhaps a bit more efficient, is I'm going to ask you 3 questions now from our audience, and you can answer them in whatever order or in whatever way you want to. So bear with me as I read
And
these questions.
forgive the lengthy responses. I'll keep it more.
No, no, you're doing great. Our audience wants to hear from you, and this is exactly what they want to hear. And I know they're also going to be interested in knowing whether you think that when you say now is the time to act, 24 hours from now, 48 hours from now, will the protests have died out because of the fact that the U.S. hasn't done anything? Or does this depend on the U.S. doing anything or not? So we'd love to hear more about that. But meanwhile, let me get to the first three questions from our audience. And I encourage the audience to please send me your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom. First question is, wouldn't it be fair to say that if the Islamic Republic is prepared to brutally repress the protests, regardless of the international repercussions, then the Islamic Republic is not on the verge of collapse? First question. Second question, what can other countries do to effectively help the protesters since the brutal regime has a monopoly on weapons and guns and firearms, and is using them against the protesters, as you told us? What nations do you think, Behnam, could make an appeal? To which nations, rather, could the Iranian protesters make an appeal for likely help? European, American, others in the region? Who would the protesters likely appeal to for help? And then finally, what level of support does the regime maintain among the overall population? Are we talking about 90% want a new regime, or only 10%, but they happen to be very vocal and in the streets? So if you can take those three questions first, we'd appreciate it.
Sure. So anecdotal back of the envelope calculations tied to some of the regime's own internal deliberations that have leaked out over the years give you a picture of, at best, 1 in 5 Iranians supports the Islamic Republic in its entirety. You would have to unpack that 1 in 5 as ideological inclination, plus political orientation, plus religious affiliation, plus economic dependency. So those different factors come together to give you the very, very unempirical back of the envelope assessment, that 1 in 5. Why I feel comfortable sticking with a not so empirical 1 in 5 is because you've had, in this boom and bust cycle of protests, a very diverse demography, a very diverse geography, plus the phenomenon that we see on Iranians internally on social media and in cyberspace, how vocal they are. The great silent majority of Iranians has not been so silent, has been paying the price for their non-silence. And I think we can be exceptionally comfortable to say 80+% of the population has some strong level of disgust, distaste with the Islamic Republic, and would like a more representative system. So that, I think, gets to the bottom half of the question. Moving upwards to look at what other countries are out there, countries can do only what their core competencies enable them to. You wouldn't ask the Netherlands to go send a carrier strike group somewhere. But the Netherlands Foreign Ministry, I have to tell you, has been punching well above its weight compared to America's other European partners when it comes to statements in solidarity. The Australian Foreign Ministry is getting there, but then again, Australia had a pretty strong 2025 because after many years, it proscribed the IRGC, it kicked out the Iranian ambassador, and it closed their embassy. And I think out of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing countries in the Anglosphere, only 2 of 5 still retain embassies in Iran. So this depends a great deal on the countries that we're looking at. My baseline assessment is, if you are an American partner in that Five Eyes intelligence architecture, or in NATO, or in the G7, you should prescribe using your counterterrorism authorities the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in its entirety. This has no immediate effect other than putting wind beneath the wings of Iranian protesters. The Iranian protesters don't expect countries to do that which they cannot do for themselves already. So given that this is a sticky move, a challenging move for some countries, that would be taken as a costly measure of support and, again, put wind beneath the wings. It's all about leveling the playing field, all about knowing the wants and needs of Iranian protesters and being able to channel that through the proper messaging and core competencies of each state. Some other states can go further. The UK, for example, has shown that it has strong asset forfeiture capabilities going after the Iranian kleptocrats who've bought at big, expensive homes and have big, expensive properties and have been able to park dirty foreign money acquired through corrupt practices abroad. Similarly, if you are a U.S. partner, uh, even in the region, for example, places like the UAE, you should not be a permissive hub for sanctions busting. If you're a country like America, for example, that is willing to take Venezuelan tankers, how come you might not be willing to take Iranian tankers and put the squeeze on the security forces so they don't generate revenue? So the answer will depend a great deal on who the target country is, but no doubt operating principle number one, do no harm. Operating principle number two, do not let a big delta to exist between your strategies and your values. Operating principle number three, if you're going to say something, you better follow that up with doing something. And operating principle number four, that doing something needs to be consistent with the rest of your national security strategy towards Iran. And that should all feed into A, leveling the playing field between the street and the state, and B, not being afraid to take those costly steps that could put wind beneath the wings of Iranian protesters. Those are the kind of operating principles. And then lastly, to go to the first part of the question, which pertained to violence and the monopoly of violence and the regime's willingness to use force. Yes, this is not the late Shah's regime where, the slur against the poor guy was that he was the suitcase monarch when the going got tough, he was willing to leave. Ali Khamenei, I believe, both consistent with his ideology and consistent with his past practice, is not going to go to Russia to play video games like Bashar al-Assad was. I don't think he'll even turn himself to his own population. I hope to God for the peace and stability of the future of Iran that I'm wrong, but he seems like a guy who would be willing to make you burn through the country just to get him, or to go kind of down with the ship, consistent with his martyrology and state in life as an 86-year-old ideologue who is the longest serving contemporary autocrat in the Middle East. All of that being said, because the regime retains a monopoly on violence, and in a society that is increasingly protesting, and in a society that is increasingly protesting against an armed state, that is why even in a very nationalist kind of country like Iran, the discourse domestically, and then because it takes time for things to get out and kind of socialize their way into the diaspora, the discourse abroad as well has increasingly moved towards, is there some kind of more nuanced, more strategic form of R2P that could be married to help, again, level the playing field between the street and the state, such that if Iranians are going to go out there and quite literally give their lives, they know that it would have been followed up with something else, not just merely the shaving off of the best and the brightest and the boldest and the bravest of the next generation of protesters, as we've seen for over a decade now.
All right, thank you. Very, very eloquently stated. Thank you. Lots of questions from the audience. Let me continue. First is, we asked about support for the regime among the population. Same question, but with respect to Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. What do people in the country feel about him? What role might he play in the future? Figurehead, symbolic, or something more than that, or not at all? Help us understand that, number one. Number two, press reports over the last few days indicated that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Qatar appealed to the Trump administration not to take military action. But there was also reporting from the Israeli press that Netanyahu himself urged Trump not to take military action, at least not now, to wait a little while longer. Can you comment on that? And can you also comment on where Russia and China might be in all of this? Let me leave it with those two, and then we'll come back for more.
Sure. So let me again work backwards because it's easier. The Russia and China element, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea are going to be constituting the largest state threats to the Western order, to the neoliberal order, to the pro-American order, we can say. They're very different states with very different ideologies, but they have this baseline anti-Americanism, this baseline kind of hostility, revisionist, predation, irredentism, whatever you want to call it, that creates kind of bubbles of chaos around them. And they're intent on using both military force and, the full spectrum of other forms of state power to go against America and America's partners in their respective regions and overturn the balance. And it's in that sense that if we don't have a good track record of living up to our words and our threats when it comes to the weakest of the axis of aggressors, which, by the way, is the only non-nuclear one, we may not have a straight line when it comes to being able to signal credibility or signal resolve or generate meaningful deterrence without the application of force, which would be politically costly against a much stronger adversary like a Russia or China in a, God forbid, future Ukraine situation or a, God forbid, Taiwan nightmare situation. And therefore, it behooves us to get it right on Iran. Just like I think Donald Trump criticized his predecessor for, the botched Afghanistan withdrawal, being able to kind of water down the deterrent messaging to Putin before the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The whole world is watching, like a 1968 moment, and they're drawing inferences about American resolve. So that's why it's important to get this right, not least, of course, for the president personally, who is looking to draw a sharp contrast with Obama 2013 on the whole Syria red line debacle. So all of that is to say, if you can generate meaningful deterrence here, if you can kind of generate meaningful credibility here, it can have a positive contagion effect in this axis of aggressors for the future of your strategic competition against Iran's partners, as well as potentially if you do more than just the Venezuela, if you actually empower the streets against the state, you really cut off the legs of the tripod of this axis of aggressors, and you make, the base for Chinese and Russian interference and influence in the Middle East less welcoming than before. And that's a net win in the 21st century when we're looking at different domains of competition and different spheres of influence. So at least that's the Russia and China element there. Going a bit more backward into the GCC countries, at least some of them, as well as Israel, I have great concern here, but there's two different sources of concern. Pains me to say this. I hope I'm wrong, and I hope the situation changes. Things are very, very fluid with Israel. With Israel, it's not about when they're loudest; it's about actually when they're quietest. When the real punch comes. That's the past is prologue. Just look at the history of Israeli both covert and overt military operations. But I did hear this from an Iranian activist, and I couldn't unhear it because, again, one of the most popular characters in Iran, besides President Trump, is Prime Minister Netanyahu, whatever your politics are, because of, again, the perception of having pushed back so meaningfully and in a way that could have been politically costly to themselves against the Islamic Republic. And it is there that this phrase that I heard hit home, which was, he looked us in the pupil, meaning the number of statements that you had from the prime minister, as well as from some members of his cabinet, as well as in general from lots of Israelis in the post 12-day war space, promising support to Iranian protesters, saying we're with you. Again, that can have a point of diminishing returns where if Iranians are dying in scores and in thousands like they have never before, and again, Iran is not the rest of the Middle East. It has no modern history of national insurgency, national civil war, multiple foreign, it doesn't have that. The last one was the Iran-Iraq war, and that is what helped get the Islamic Republic on this path-dependent, crazy obsession with deterrence. So make no mistake, if we lose this constituency in the heartland of the Muslim world, it will be even messier moving forward. So I can understand in terms of, again, someone who spends a lot of time looking at national security policy here, in terms of the missile math alone, why Israel may have a little bit of hesitancy in terms of the planning and the assets. Israel surprised everybody with the kind of assets that it had inside Iran. It literally created a drone base in Iran during the 12-day war. It might not have what it needs in place. Who knows? But that, again, creates a massive delta between the messaging and the action, between the perception and the reality. And unfortunately, in between those two is a river of blood of Iranian protesters and smiling theocrats and revolutionary guardsmen who have only been too willing to say America and Israel will sell you out and will not have your back. So that the least common denominator, step number one, do no harm, that ought to be augmented or moderated. And again, too soon to tell. It's only January 15. But given the fact that it is assumed, and we don't have the same volume because of the internet cutout, that the protest volume has been cut, the window for action is closing. Conversely, to go to the other side of the Middle East, the GCC countries, that has a lot more to do with, in my view, the botched politics of Iran policy for decades now, from the Bush administration and the sectarianization of Iraq and the freedom agenda that some of these countries may have had a qualm with, to the JCPOA and the nuclear deal politics and being frozen out there, and to the Obama administration leading from behind and the mixed messaging on Syria versus Libya, and then ultimately the politics of the Yemen war, both in Congress and was both Trump and Obama in the White House, let alone Khashoggi, let alone energy politics post-Ukraine, that have gotten a lot of these countries to be much more skeptical of American support, particularly even when President Trump was back in office and he didn't respond kinetically to the strikes against Saudi oil facilities. So all of this has kind of made more acute countries who live quite literally on the front lines of Iran's most dangerous weapons, which, by the way, is also home to where some of America's most prominent basing structures are on the Arab side of the Persian Gulf. And, Iran's short-range ballistic missiles are a heck of a lot more precise than their medium-range ballistic missiles that they had fired at Israel in April 2024, October 2024, and June 2025. And so the real fear there is there could be a squeezing effect, and the receptibility of these countries to Iranian threats, be it proxies from the Houthis or the regime directly, has actually put American partners like Saudi Arabia in this hedging position. Because if they've been calling the sheriff for so long and the sheriff isn't coming, they believe in the short term to be able to stabilize their economies, to be able to avoid having a conflict come onto their soil, to be able to fix their economies, to get to a 2030, 2035 drastically different economy. They can't afford a crisis. So therefore, they are choosing to pay to play, pay to accommodate the thief, limp along because they have qualms with the international environment and live to see another day. And this is much more balancing and bandwagoning kind of thinking and managing a crisis than solving a crisis. And that comes from them not having the sufficient confidence in U.S. foreign policy at this time. And that has now had a dampening effect, reportedly per the Wall Street Journal, on President Trump's actual willingness to use force. Who knows? That may change. Who knows? President Trump may be influenced by someone else. But I think with the president, what we learned in term one is it's not about him. It's not about those around him. It is going to be about him. And it's going to be about his decision making and his perception of his legacy. And here I would say, both to draw a sharp contrast with that which he wishes to draw with President Obama in the past, as well as that which he wishes to have for the future, which is some kind of title of peacemaker for the region. There is no way out but through here with the crisis in Iran, because the internet at some point in time will come back on. And we will see that the red line was not the only thing that is so red when the images and the videos come back. Let me just end with this. I'm sorry this went so long. But
No.
out of
And don't
everything
forget the question about Mohammad Reza Pahlavi.
yes, I'll get to that. Oh, good point. Out of everything I've heard and seen in this 3 weeks, the thing that I can't get out of my head in terms of coming from Iran rather than something you hear is a screenshot of a text, like a post. And so it's just print. It's just like Persian Comic Sans print. Where someone is talking about during the first 2 or 3 days of the internet shutout, having gone outside in the morning because the repression apparatus recedes, the protesters recede, and there's an eerie kind of fog of war, eerie kind of calm as the government tries to reassert authority and present, quote unquote, an image of normalcy during the periods of the daytime. There was a post where a guy was saying he went out and he saw laborers, government laborers, people who clean the streets, having to use power washers to wash the blood off the street. And I can't just even get reading the line out of, they use the word asphalt, but like having to power wash the blood out of the asphalt. I can't get that out of my head. And those were the things we will see rather than read when these photos and videos come back. And to the first question, which is the last question, the exiled crown prince Reza Pahlavi. So the irony of ironies, particularly when you're looking at, and I'm going to touch the third rail here, diaspora politics, opposition politics, is that those who tend to be abroad tend to actually have elite support, but tend to not have a ground game, tend to not have grassroots support. And the analytical assumption for a very long time, particularly in Washington, where I live and work, as well as other Western capitals, is that because it's the son of a monarch, there's this lap of luxury stereotype, plus, of course, the fact that there was a genuine social revolution in 1979 against that direction, that cut against the grain, plus, of course, that legacy of U.S. intervention. Those would all militate against his popularity, let alone the American experience in Iraq and working with exiles. That being said, literally the exact opposite has been the case with Pahlavi. My assessment is that he actually does not have major elite support. He's been auditioning for major elite support. That's why everyone is hanging on every word of Trump commentary. Trump said he's a nice guy. I'm not sure how popular he is, but if his country's okay with him, then I'm okay with him. Will Trump meet with him? Won't he meet with him? This historic news by Axios over the past few days that allegedly he met with Special Representative Steve Witkoff. There's all this stuff is being detected now. Why? And why is it mattering now? Because that last element, that domestic element, that ground game has actually exploded more than ever before. I mean, one, weird, funny measure is while some, more left-leaning Israeli outlets were saying the Pahlavi supporters are all bots and whatnot, Reza Pahlavi's social media standing dropped immensely when the internet went out in Iran, which is a measure of how much domestic support he has. Conversely, from December 2017, when they chanted his grandfather's name in the holy city of Mashhad, all the way up to January 2026, where in the hometown of Ayatollah Khomeini, the founding father of the Islamic Republic, in the small town of Khomein in central Iran, they are chanting Javid Shah, they're chanting Long Live the King, just shows you the straight line of rising nationalism in Iran and the ability of the Crown Prince and his team, despite diaspora drama, despite diaspora politics, despite everything that has come with trying to create a more unified opposition front, to be able to have a sizable majority and to develop the prevailing dominant discourse against the regime, which is if they are Islamist, we are nationalist. And because the criticism against him for so long has been he's more mild-mannered, he's more moderate, he is the one that can actually tamp down the excesses of nationalism that we've seen in some other places. So while some in Western Europe, you can see nationalism go in a drastically different direction, actually with Iran, nationalism in terms of the foreign and security policy would not be predation, it would be an Iran come home moment. That's why even if you pushed past the Pahlavi stuff, one of the most consistent slogans that you get even before 2017 is Na Ghaze, Na Lubnan, Janam Fadai Iran, which is not Gaza, not Lebanon, my life only for Iran. So all of this works in his favor. And it's kind of been analytically here for me in DC, the irony of ironies that, we're looking at elite support, but actually this person has massive ground support, and yet for some reason there was an allergy against his name. I would just point you to a piece by a really good, enterprising Washington Post reporter, Yegane Torbati, who interviewed a bunch of diaspora people, but she's based in Turkey now, about the kind of the kaleidoscope of Pahlavi amid these protests. And she got a source in Iran, I think a young woman in Tehran, who was saying that she wasn't a supporter, but who understood now that the stakes are him or death. And I got to tell you, one interesting vector of his increasing popularity is, despite drama within exiled royalist diaspora that may not be in touch with the streets of the youth today. One reason why he is immensely popular among the youth is that he's not auditioning yet for monarch. He's really auditioning to be the bridge to the other side, where if he can get you to a post-Islamic Republic future, then the country can finally, after 100+ years, be at the ballot box meaningfully and decide republic or monarchy and have the people from within govern. But me, analytically, and I'll stop here, I think it's important to footnote, one reason why I think this is an option, and I think it's a good option, and I think with the Middle East we should not make the perfect the enemy of the good, is that in a society like the Islamic Republic, where the crackdown is so immense and the repression from the state against the street and even civil society is so immense, you cannot have an organic political leader, which is why the charge against Iranian protests for so long is that they're leaderless or organizationless. Now the protesters are saying who they want, and it's no surprise to me that it's an external figure, because what exists in Iran today are, in my view, not yet political leaders. What exists are all revolutionaries. The leadership has to come from outside. Unless we forget, even Ayatollah Khomeini in France had to come from outside. Because whenever you're having this battle between the state and the street, it's going to be hard in an authoritarian society to be able to develop from within when there's a willingness to use force from the top against the bottom.
Great. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much for your incredible analysis and your observations. It's so helpful. And thank you to the audience for all the great questions. We've got about 20 minutes left. Please keep, excuse me, the questions coming. Just a couple of technical ones that came from our audience, from more than one audience member, people interested in where they can go on the internet to get the most reliable news about what is happening in Iran, number one. Number two, what is the current status of the effort to use Starlink to reactivate the internet? Number three, we have seen some videos that have been able to make their way to external media in Europe and the US. How is that happening? How are those videos getting out given the internet shutdown? Is telephone service still shut off in the country? Um, and uh, well, I'll leave it at that, and then I'll come back to more substantive questions when you finish that.
So I'll try to be quick about this, and again, I apologize. I wanted to go into detail because there is so much richness to unpack, and in seminar format, that's where we can get into the minutia. But on the
To the
last point,
contrary, your in-depth analysis is exactly what our audience is most interested in. So
thank
thank
you,
you.
thank you. So on the communications environment, um, in the past 3 days, landlines have been a bit more reachable. Corollary to that is that some cell carriers during the day have been able to not message but call. I think this is selective by the regime, both in terms of what they need for day-to-day stuff, and also if we're going to, play into the red teaming of what a national security state would do, they need to kind of assuage people abroad, given the family members that are at home, that things are okay, because the regime, under the cover of the internet blackout, is trying to move pieces around to create the impression of normalcy. That's why they're trying to clean up in the mornings before the next round of protests at nights. That's why they want family members to call and say, yes, we're okay, to dampen the pressure that could come from abroad. And as well as if people are saying things that are operational or really informational, to listen and then to move forcefully against them and repress them. So in the 3-day window, there has been landlines, slightly less than that 3-day window, calling from select cell carriers, but still the norm has been the national internet, called the intranet, has been online for parts of the morning and afternoon in the country. Again, to try to kind of keep things in the .ir domain available, to push people towards that kind of bubble. But broadly, it's an internet blackout with 1% to 2% connectivity for a week. And against that context, that's where Starlink has been fairly active. But that's why the regime has been going against Starlink to physically do raids in places where they believe it exists, confiscate it, and do unspeakable things to the houses and the families and the people that actually have these receivers. Two is to, on the physical side, if not confiscated, on the military side, basically using electronic warfare, spoofing or jamming, two different things, one assumedly tech from Russia, one assumedly tech from China, to either throw off the signal between the receiver and the satellite that is in low Earth orbit, those commercially available satellites, or to have it send a different signal, or just to be kind of fuzzy and static and oscillate between periods of connectivity, which is why since the internet blackdown came into effect on January 8th, sometimes you would get a surge of stuff, or you might have friends or acquaintances or family members or whatnot with family in Iran. And hypothetically, if they're WhatsApping, that's why you would see only the one check, and it would stay the one check for a very, very long time. It's just that the data cannot communicate. That kind of explains that situation. There was even reports, in the first 2 days of the internet blackouts that some, and this is not to, impugn, this is actually a net plus, but that there was some receptivity around foreign embassies, that they had kind of taken measures from the November 2019 crackdown to make sure that, just for their purposes, because an embassy is sovereign territory, that they could have Wi-Fi, that they could have Starlink, and then some Iranians were trying to find ways to see if they could get onto that Wi-Fi or not. It was just an interesting side note, but these are all the conversations Iranians are having in public on three major applications: Twitter, X, formerly known as Twitter, Instagram, and Telegram. And then to get into the heart of your first question, there's been two very prominent accounts. I'll say them. I don't think anything will happen. That I think are worth following if you can speak Persian or do AI-enabled Google Translate or whatever else. Vahid Online and Mamlakate, that have been bringing so much of the videos together. Plus, of course, the English language and Persian language reporting of this I don't want to use the word opposition, but this diaspora media channel that really does the work of surrogate journalism called Iran International. So I would say if you have social media on those three applications, please take a look at the videos and the information coming out on those two channels. You will quite literally be plugged into what they can get from the street whenever, again, in those brief fits and starts of 1% to 2% connectivity, that they can get stuff out. People always conglomerate and send. It's important to have to verify. There's been a very important effort undertaken, I think, by BBC Verify, if I got the name correctly, to try to date and geolocate certain events and certain protests and certain people. But other than that, those two applications, those two accounts across those three applications, as well as, of course, the Iran International news page and YouTube page in English and in Persian together could be a very good localized source that gives you a different feel, a much more kind of open source intelligence feel rather than just open source reporting feel as to what is going on in Iran.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was incredibly informative. Really appreciate that. I've got three more audience questions for you, and if you want to take the remaining 13, 14 minutes to address these, if not, we'll come back with more. So first, has there been any indication of any dissent within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, or among any of the other security or police services? Any indication of any cracks in loyalty to the regime? That's the first one. Second one, some questioners are wondering why we haven't seen any protests on U.S. campuses like we have in other contexts. I won't name other examples. We all know what they are, but why haven't we seen any protests? What can people do? Ordinary people here who are concerned for the future of the Iranian people to get the word out, to try to galvanize support for them. And then finally, several people are asking you, Behnam, if you were in President Trump's chair, what specific actions would you take? You say the window is closing. What specific actions would you take in the next 24 to 48 to 72 hours?
Very tough questions. I'm going to do my best to answer them
Okay.
honestly, knowing full well that there's going to be limitations. But the
And you've
first
got
one,
12 minutes to answer the questions.
12 minutes? Okay. The first one was, forgive me, the first one was,
The first one was about any signs of dissent, cracks.
okay, yes. So this is the X factor. There has been no short, there has been no shortage of bravery from protesters. How you get street power translated into an effective force that is more than just disruption or disruptive to a repressive state is in two additional stages. Stage one, which we've seen, it hasn't been as widespread across all the sectors that we would like, but there is a big history of that happening in Iran organically anyway. So there's room for cautious optimism there, which is strikes, and in particular labor strikes in key sectors. For example, I think there was a near 2-week-long trucker strike right before the 12-day war. And Iran has had no shortage of teacher strikes, labor union strikes, agricultural food vendors. There's a whole host of very active kind of labor union world in Iran that if that happens coterminous, street power and strike power, it kind of gives an economic and coercive tool to popular protests against the state. But the way you really, quote unquote, turn it to 11 is that you actually can foster defections of the security forces. And thus far, you are right, there hasn't been any kind of defections in mass from that spinal cord, which we call the apparatus of repression. You have at the top the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. You have within one of the branches of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps the ground forces, the Basij, which is the old volunteer paramilitary. That's basically the check on all forms of civil society. There are uniformed versions and plainclothes versions of them. Then there is the actual national police, the law enforcement forces, which is basically like their crack, like riot troops, if you will. It's under that paradigm that you also have under the LEF. You have like the morality police, the people that went out circa doing the Women Life Freedom, doing the kind of the crackdown on the women. But even further down there, you have vigilante groups that basically are tied to the paramilitary, but that go one step beyond paramilitary. Sometimes you hear in Persian they're called lebas shakhsi, plain clothes. And then some of those groups, which actually even though they're plain clothes, they still have semi-formal to formal affiliations with this national security state. Some of them have even been sanctioned, I think, like Ansar Hezbollah, for example. These are little squadrons of these people that basically create street power for the state before you deploy fully uniformed people. It's like kind of hooliganism, if you will. But this is the command and control. We haven't seen at any of the major levels sufficient public proclamations of support or sympathy for the protesters, nor to follow that up with defections. And this is really the X factor, because if you get the guys with the guns to flip, it's all about pulling at the patriotic heartstrings, plus creating a pathway for an alternative. If you remember two things from the 1979 revolution, and again, apples and oranges, totally different. The Shah was not at all these guys. The Shah's army was not at all this apparatus of repression. Very different situation, but just worth learning the lessons of history. Number one, there was a slogan the revolutionaries came up with to go after the conscripts in particular from all around Iran and the Shah's army. And they allegedly would put carnations in the barrels of the rifles, and they would say, it rhymes in Persians. They say, we gives you flowers, you give us bullets. There is some kind of version of that underway to foster defections, but it hasn't yielded those results. The second thing is that once you get the military leadership to defect rather than the conscripts, then you can have the pathway to political change. But they have to feel that pressure from within their own institutions, so they have to be much more rancorous and cacophonous within each other. They have to have a bigger fight about the shrinking piece of the pie. They have to feel that they have something to lose from foreign pressure, and they have something to lose from domestic pressure. So they have to, from a self-interest individual level, and then a self-interest group and unit level, feel that they have something to save and a pathway out. And that's why they keep shooting their way out of the crisis so far. All of that being said, it is still the X factor, if so much as, to go back to the 79 parallel, February 11, 1979 is popularly called Islamic Revolution Victory Day. But if we remember the timeline, January 16, tomorrow, 1979 is when the late Shah fled. February 1st is when Ayatollah Khomeini came back from Paris. And then February 11, that 10-day period, that's called the 10 Days of Dawn, Verge, that's like the 10 days of deep revolutionary activity. And the day the National Army, the SCAF, basically declared neutrality was the day of Victory Day for the Islamic Revolution. So it's either about co-opting the leadership or getting the leadership to step aside and declare neutrality, which in essence means the street takes over the state. So that's the debate about defections, and that is not what we haven't seen yet. And that is something that both the opposition and Uncle Sam can do a lot more to foster, both with pressure and with support. Question number two, forgive me, I went on so long. Question number two
Just about the
was,
lack of protests, no campus activity, no
oh,
people in
here.
streets. And in Europe too. We're not seeing
Um,
demonstrations in support of the Iranian people. Why not?
Unfortunately, because it's across the West, unfortunately, that says a lot more about us, a society, us, the West, and that which many in the West believe is worth protesting over. And I can't help but notice the correlation of forces here. That and I'll touch the third rail. Like, the Palestinian cause gets out an increasingly diverse cross section of society. But the Iranian cause, literally 20,000, up 12 to 20,000, depending on the number, CBS number, Iran International number, IRA number, Harana number, whichever numbers you want to take, dying in the darkness. And if pulling at the heartstrings is insufficient for you, pulling at the headstrings, the strategic argument, the most pro-American, the most pro-Israeli country in that part of the world, and perhaps it is the fact that it is this population that, when most of the Arab and Muslim world turned a blind eye to 9/11, Iranian civilians went out holding a candlelight vigil for Americans. When most of the Arab and Muslim world came out and unfortunately celebrated after the imagery came out after October 7, 2023, Iranians went literally in the opposite direction, soccer stadiums filled to the brim with thousands, drowning out Basijis, drowning out, state vigilantes who had taken out Palestinian flags to celebrate October 7, and crowds chanting, telling them to shove that you know where. So it's a fundamentally different demographic. And unfortunately, it is telling us about a fundamentally different value set that exists within our society. And we can pretend it's not there, or we can try very hard on a daily basis, on an individual level, for all of us to be the best brand ambassadors for what we believe in to try to engage and get them to see the light.
Okay. And then finally, 4 more minutes. Tell us what you would do specifically, next 24 to 72 hours if you were running the United States government.
Um, Step number one, it's too late for this one, but it's something that you should start off anyway. NSA in the US and Unit 8200 in Israel need to have a coordinated cyber campaign against the Islamic Republic in its entirety. Step number two, high-level meeting between President Trump and Reza Pahlavi, fully supporting a transition council and the idea of pushing past the Islamic Republic. This will have a contagion effect and put wind beneath the wings of protesters. Step number three, either kinetically against the physical locations that house the jamming equipment in Iran. No U.S. commentary about it, but just kinetically with standoff weaponry, radio silence against the physical locations housing the satellite spoofing material, the jamming material that is thwarting the Starlinks in Iran, destroying that. Step number four, high-level public commentary from the US once that stuff is destroyed about having restored the internet in Iran and giving the regime an ultimatum that there would be both a counter-missile campaign and, more importantly, a counter-security forces campaign, and really, getting the street out there and marrying street power with foreign power. I mean, this is the unfortunately, it is coming down to a kinetic situation. And again, I take my cues from the street. And if the street is willing to have this, if the street is looking to the West for support, and support, sanctions are welcome, satellites and Starlinks are welcome, but and messaging is welcome, but those are the things you do to help the next round of Iranian protests. Those are not the things you do as protests are going on and thousands are being killed. It has to move either into the covert cyber campaign world or into the overt kinetic world. And it's all about the targets. But President Trump did say something that made me cautiously optimistic. Again, he could be hedging in any direction. He could be faking us out now when it comes to retreating and maybe duping some of those GCC states, and then next week getting ready to go big or go home. We have no idea. But it behooves the U.S. first and foremost to have a contingency plan about how to secure some of this stuff, to be working with the opposition about how to have a transition properly, and then next, to actually have a theory of victory. President Trump a few days ago told a CBS reporter when he was asked what's his end game, he said the end game is to win. We have to know what winning looks like. We have to dare to imagine. We have to articulate that winning means a partnership with the next government in Iran that represents the views, values, and interests of the Iranian people and locks in that pro-American and pro-Israeli disposition of society into the next round of state. It's going to be super bumpy. But rather than treat the military element, which is the newest element to potentially enter his maximum pressure campaign, rather than treat that as an operation, it must be treated actually as a low-intensity campaign, real-time ISR about the next round of crowds, real-time ISR as to where Basijis are coming from, real-time. If you're an Iranian protester and hypothetically there's an Israeli airstrike on a far-off nuclear facility during these protests, that is going to have little to no bearing on you staying in the street. What is going to have bearing is to know that the security camera and that the local Basij base in your neighborhood is no longer there and is no longer working. And in this way, you can begin to sandwich the state and get the state, this is controversial, but get the state to make mistakes. If they choose to do what they've threatened to do, which is to fire at Israel, which is to fire at American bases, they have to know that they would be leading with their chin. So part of this cycle that we're in, and we can't get out of, unless, of course, we want to forfeit to the Islamic. We have to be brutally honest. We can choose to forfeit. We can choose to say, you won this round. We can choose to say this region doesn't matter. Or we can choose to say that we have one pathway here. We have an idea of victory. We have an idea of what comes next. We can work. And actually, over the past 46 years, 47 years, we thought we were managing the problem. It turned out that the problem was managing us. And we're going to push past that paradigm. It is gutsy, it is dangerous, it is fraught with risk, it is costly, it is expensive. But here's my pitch to the president. The alternative is even more costly. The alternative is even more fraught with risk. It's not that you have stasis and stability in the Middle East by locking in the Islamic Republic. That's the mistake that the Gulf Arabs are making right now. That's the mistake that others in the region might be making right now. You invite the next cycle of escalation by locking these guys in at the helm. If for human rights perspective, if for human rights reasons, you worry about the costs of a regime change policy, well, consider the costs of a policy of stasis of 20,000 killed in the darkness. Of just President Trump said that there's a stay of execution, but there were 2,035 reported executions last year. The regime doubling its own records, hitting 2015 era highs. So clearly there is no pause in the national security state cracking down. And once these videos come out, oh my God, as to what we're all going to be seeing. We had friends just the other day saying we're all going to be seeing things like the videos that came out of the GoPros with Hamas and the gliders and the people that broke through the barriers on October 7 back in Israel. So that on that perspective, we've already paid the price. On if you don't care about this stuff and you care about just the narrow nuclear issue and the missile issue, and you say, hey, if there's like a decapitation, there's going to be a contagion effect, and there's a loose nukes problem, and kind of like the Soviet Union. Well, yeah, that's a problem, but there we have a ditch row. We have to have contingency plans. But hey, right now with the regime at the helm, there are over 400 kilograms of missing uranium. So it's not like we don't have that problem right now. If you're worried about missile bases and everything being dispersed, well, the regime already has a decentralized command and control because 12 of their commanders are gone, and you have a whole bunch of missile bases with who knows what the firing formula is. If you're worried about a potential refugee flow and human wavelength level catastrophe by trying to go towards regime change, I posit to you that this regime staying in power and helping the Assad regime stay in power has helped beget one of the biggest refugee flows with huge political, economic, and social effects on not just us, but more importantly, our European partners, which will change the demography, geography, and politics of Europe for years to come. So for all the reasons that might induce one to lean towards stasis, I say to the president, you've already paid forward the costs of stasis. You've already paid forward through a policy of stasis the cost of regime change. Now is the time to dare to actually move and try to achieve the benefits. And again, I say fully it is fraught with challenge and risk, but on balance, those challenges and risks outweigh underweigh the benefits of moving towards something else. So we have to understand that we've been paying those costs and risks in dribs and drabs for years. And I think with the exception of Israel, there are very few places in the Middle East that one can marry their head and their heart, their strategy and their values. And if we are going to get strategic competition in the 21st century right, we have to get this issue right to finally pivot. If you like the Abraham Accords, you're going to love the Cyrus Accords. There is no way out but through. We can make the conflicts of the region imminently smaller, imminently more manageable, move them from conflicts of religion into conflicts over land by taking the arsonist out of the fires of this region. And that begins with a policy to end the Islamic Republic.
Okay. Behnam Ben Taleblu, thank you again for your insight, for your analysis, and for so generously giving us your time today. We are deeply grateful to you. We will post the recording of this webinar on the UCLA Yunus and Soraya Nazarian Center website. So for those of you who joined us from the audience, please let your friends and colleagues know that they missed a great webinar today and they can watch the recording. I want to thank our audience for their tremendous questions, which were just so terrific. I want to thank again our co-sponsors, the UCLA Center for Middle East Development, the UCLA Department of Public Policy, the Principles for Peace Foundation in Geneva, Switzerland. We're going to put up a slide now showing some of our upcoming programs. We invite you to look at our website. Please join us in the next few weeks. We have some amazing programs coming up on our webinar series. Thank you so much to everyone. Behnam, thank you again, and all the very, very best to you. And we do hope to see you here at UCLA in person at some point in the future. We'll
Thank you
sign
so
off now.
much.
Thank you very much, everyone, and a happy Martin Luther King Day holiday weekend to all of you.